Hello everyone, this is Dr. Gabrielle Orsi, Project Manager with the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and welcome to our webinar. It's our official start time, so we're going to go ahead and get started with a few housekeeping items. This webinar is Developing Anti-Racism Strategies in Behavioral Health Agencies with Dr. Stewart. I'd like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. The Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is based in Seattle, Washington, and our center is located on the traditional land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. It's important to us to take a moment to acknowledge the rich and complex history of our region. The Northwest MHTTC is part of a national network that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Our purpose includes disseminating and implementing evidence-based practices for mental health issues into the workforce. Some of the other network goals include supporting mental health-related evidence-based practices, heightening the awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, fostering regional and national alliances, and providing and connecting you with free training and technical assistance like today's webinar. A little more about us specifically here at the Northwest MHTTC. We proudly serve HS Region 10, that's Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington State. Our area of focus is evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues such as psychosis, but we do provide training on a variety of topics, including integrated care, diversity, equity issues, school mental health, peer support, and much, much more. Our target workforce includes behavioral health and primary care providers, school and social service staff, and others whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or at risk of developing serious mental illness. We fulfill our mission through live events like this one, virtual learning communities, free online courses, newsletters, a resource library, and a whole lot more. We encourage you to visit our website, follow us on social media, and subscribe to our newsletter to stay in the loop with what we are doing. A note on language: we encourage everyone to use language that respects people's dignity and worth, is culturally appropriate, and consistent with recovery-oriented practices. We want to take a minute as well to remind you that we are recording this webinar today, so keep confidentiality issues in mind. We're getting to the end of the housekeeping. We are in a webinar format, so everyone is muted with their video off. We'll share out a recording from today and a certificate of attendance for folks who were here at the live session. If you need to indicate that you're having a technical support issue or ask a generic question, the chat is open. Everyone can see what you post in the chat. We've got staff who are going to monitor the chat today. If you have a topical question about the subject matter of today's presentation, please use the Q&A feature on the toolbar. That helps us keep all of those important questions in one place for easy reference later when we have a Q&A session at the end of a presentation today. If you really get stuck and you can't use the Q&A though, that's all right. Put it in the chat. We'd rather get your questions than not. We will be providing the link to an evaluation survey at the end of today's webinar, and we would really, really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to fill out that evaluation survey. It's required by SAMHSA, our grantor, and it helps us improve trainings and keep the free trainings coming. So, disclaimer that although we are sponsored by SAMHSA, this webinar does not reflect an official SAMHSA position on the content provided here today. I won't bore you with reading the whole disclaimer, but that sort of sums it up that we are funded by SAMHSA, but this presentation does not present an official view of SAMHSA. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ashley Stewart. Dr. Stewart is an adjunct expert trainer and curriculum development specialist for C4 Innovations. She received her PhD from The Ohio State University College of Social Work and her master's at Columbia University. She's an assistant professor at Temple University College of Public Health, School of Social Work, where she works with interdisciplinary students about social justice theories and frameworks and translational skills for anti-oppressive practice. She also conducts implementation of anti-oppressive practices at organizational, structural, programmatic, and clinical interventions. And there's just so much more I could say about her research and her nuanced understanding of these difficult and complex issues. But it is just, in short, my general pleasure to welcome back Dr. Ashley Stewart, our presentation today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to return. I'm wondering if there's some folks in the chat or who are participating today who were part of the session last time. So if you are, let me know in the chat. And if you're not, welcome. And it is my pleasure to be able to spend the next hour or so with you. Okay, great. So there are some folks returning back. Good. And for folks who this is your first time in the session, we'll go back over some of the foundation stuff that we talked about last time to make sure we're all on the same pages in terms of the conversation. So for the folks who were here last session, no, I take a very engaged approach. I need folks to be in the chat. I want to hear that folks are coming back. It's so good to see all of you again. And so please, I welcome everyone to use the chat very actively. I know that might not be traditional of some webinars that you've attended to, but you know, this is how we're gonna build a community as we engage in some really difficult conversation today. So please feel welcome to use the chat. It won't distract me. And in fact, it'll allow me to be able to engage with you throughout the session. A few things. When you send things through chat, you have the option to send it to panelists and attendees or things just to the panelists. If you send it to the panelists, it just shows to the folk who are on this screen here. And know that if you ever send something to panelists, I won't read your name if I'm acknowledging or addressing something that you put in the chat. So that's a way that you can ask a question or you can use the QA and choose to ask anonymous questions. And I also encourage folks to select panelists and attendees and let's engage in a conversation throughout the presentation today as well. Awesome. Yes, we are. We're so excited that y'all are here. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing some slides. But welcome to continue to let us know where you're joining from in the chat as we get started with the presentation. Okay. So today's topic, I know you know because you signed up for it, but I'm just going to remind you what you got yourself into. We're going to be talking about developing anti-racist strategies and behavioral health spaces, okay? So one of the things that I want us to engage with is that we're talking about anti-racism. We're talking about a critical issue that I know for a fact, I'm not even going to do my polling. I know for a fact that has been a focal point of the conversations that you all have been having, more so now than ever before in this in the different spaces that you occupy. For some folks, they like to share that, yes, it's happened a lot more, but still not enough. For some folks, they're saying it's happening so much they don't know how to keep up with it. And yet still some people say, even though it's happening, I don't feel prepared or engaged to talk about anti-racism. I'm not prepared to talk about racial inequities. I'm not able to talk about racism as it relates to health equity. So in the previous session, we talked about what is health equity, what is racial equity, and we got into the depths of that conversation. Today, we're going to begin to pivot into talking about what are some things that we can do as individuals. That's going to require a lot of self-work, a lot of processing, critical examination, and absolutely discomfort. So I hope that y'all are ready. Ask if there's a way to watch the first presentation. I do believe so, but I'm not quite sure. So I'm sure my colleagues here will let us know. So I think grateful for the introduction. But yes, so I focus on institutionalized forms of identity-based oppression. I do have the opportunity and the pleasure to work with folks in all different capacities to talk about equity and equity issues and forms of identity-based oppression. I teach courses on advocacy, clinical interventions, anti-oppressive clinical practice, social justice, behavioral health, power, race, oppression, and privilege. And I also have worked as a clinician, focusing on race-based traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, and am a licensed social worker as well. So I just want to go through what are some of these sessions, some of the goals for this session. Excuse me 1 second. I'm going to just move this out of my way. Okay. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to begin to formulate anti-racist practices for that are critical for behavioral health agencies. We're going to talk about how to avoid performative and siloed diversity initiatives and talk about how to start with equity. We're looking for sustainable and authentic culture shift. We want to move away from one-off programmatic exercises. I did this, and so we check the boxes. We want to see, how do you change the culture so that when people show up and are present, they're able to be included, so that people feel welcome, so that people don't have to jeopardize or compromise aspects of their identity in order to be able to participate, right? We're going to take a critical look at pervasive and innocuous consequences of racism on health. Particularly, we're going to focus today on the effects of racial trauma, race-based traumatic stress, and compounding racial trauma. And we're going to look at the role of everyone to participate in responding to those concerns. We're going to talk about dominant culture. Specifically today, we're going to talk about what is white dominant culture. And we're also going to talk about institutional biases that may uphold inequities within agencies, things for us all to be aware of, and more importantly, things for us to realize if we're perpetuating. And finally, we're going to strategize around dealing with change fatigue and resistance. If this wasn't an uncomfortable conversation, we wouldn't be doing it right. And if there wasn't resistance, then most likely we weren't making the type of progress with the type of urgency that's needed. And so we want to know how to deal with it and begin to normalize it as part of the process so we can talk openly and transparently about it. So since there are some folks who are returning, I'm going to go through these and the content's a little more dense for today. So I'm going to go through these quickly, but these are my requests for the group. In addition to these being my requests for the groups, these are also really great ways if folks want to take notes of things that stand out to you as ways to engage in conversation about race and racism, racial equity, and inequities. Okay. The first of the requests and things for us to think about as you all prepare to go do anti-racist practices within your agencies is to expect a lack of closure. There is this sentiment within dominant culture that there's going to be an end to it. There's going to be a nice bow in it. We're going to have this session and everyone's going to leave feeling inspired. Well, most likely folks are going to leave wondering more, with more engaged questions, with a desire to continue the conversation. And so we want to expect that as we process through anti-racist practices, there's going to be, in some cases, a lack of closure. We want to be able to ask for clarification. And this comes from the reality that we are all entering this conversation at different points, different places, different life experiences. So the terms or things that I might talk about might resonate differently with someone in this room. And we often take an approach of saying, okay, well, we're just not on the same page about it. But what I'm requesting is that we ask for clarification. What did you mean, Ashley, when you said X, Y, or Z? Embrace discomfort, right? This is not the work for others. This is the work for us. So we're not taking this to take back to someone. We're doing this so that we can begin to implement it for ourselves. honoring all experiences lived and expertise as well, because there are many different forms. And I think a lot of times we look at people who have studied or have credentialing and value that type of knowledge over lived experience. And I want to bring honor to lived experience in this space and recognize that experience and expertise look different based on how it presents in people's lives. Reminding us that it needs to be both a safe and a brave space. We want to be able to have a place where people feel safe enough to talk and take risks to talk about difficult conversations, but also that requires a level of bravery, because what feels safe to me might not feel safe to someone else in this space. Naming, addressing, and talking about systemic and structural racism feels very safe to me, because a lot of times my safety feels at risk. Right? But that might not be the case for some other folks. And so honoring that safety will look different. We want to acknowledge that revisiting should be welcome. We all process information differently. Some folks might not engage in the chat at all. Some folks might engage in the chat a lot. And so creating spaces for yourself, maybe even if you're here with some of your colleagues, to come back and to revisit the conversation. We want to affirm and give credit. We want to revoke the expert positioning. Many of you are occupying different leadership roles, or people are looking at you for answers. I want to give yourself some, be gentle with yourself and allow yourself not to have to feel like an expert in this space. Allow yourself to be vulnerable, to learn and to engage and to feel the feelings of this session. We're listening to understand, to hear people, not necessarily to respond. We want to be accountable for impact, because just because I intended for something to come out some way doesn't mean that that was the impact that it had. And so therefore we need to be accountable to the impact that it has. Be gentle with yourself and with others. One of my favorites is that we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. And so this is the space to do that. And then the last one that I added, so is new to some other folks, is to give yourself grace. Going through this process, there's going to be times when people are going to call us in and let us know that something that we said, we want to challenge that thought, we want to lean into that conversation more diligently. And if we can give ourselves and each other grace to say, I don't think that you intended to cause harm, but I want you to know, so that we can begin to reduce the amount of harm that we're causing onto community members. That requires the receiver to also hear that and to receive that information. And so a lot of times we look for other people to give ourselves grace when we've made a mistake. And I want to encourage folks to give yourself grace, right? There was a long time that I had been studying microaggressions at this point for probably about 10 years. And I said something that was microaggressive. And I didn't need to justify my knowledge of it. I just needed to do better and to ensure that I never caused that type of harm to anyone again. And so I had to give myself grace and not expect it from the people around me, not the people who observed it, and certainly not the person who I perpetuated it onto. And so this reads as give yourself grace, but it's really intended to say give yourself grace, if that makes sense, right? So tell me in the chat really quickly, what if any of these requests stand out to you, or strategies that you would like to use when engaging in conversations about anti-racist practices that you could see be helpful? Let me know in the chat. All of the above. Yeah. Some folks are saying listening to understand, not to respond. Understanding fatigue and resistance, to be accountable. Something new is affirm and give credit. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes we'll take things that folks share and use it as our own. And we want to create a community of honoring and respecting what people are bringing to the space. Expect lack of closure. Being open-minded, giving grace. Yes, and others to have a safe and brave space. Great. Revoking expert positioning. I appreciate that you put that in quotations. Yeah, right? We cannot challenge, we cannot acknowledge. Great. Yeah. A gentle way to respond to a person who says that they are colorblind? That's such a great question someone asked. I'm definitely going to make note of it, and I'm going to respond to that because I think that that's an important question, right? Because one of the things that I think is inherent in that question about, and maybe even some folks in this room, like, let's be transparent, have been taught to take a colorblind approach. One, the term colorblind is ableist in the context of which we're using it. But the other aspect of it is that that is a way in which we're trying to suggest that we want to treat everyone equally. We don't see color. But when the reality of it is that because there is an equity gap within our society, because people have experienced systemic and structural oppression, because people live this each and every day, race and color does play a major role in people's safety, well-being, and life circumstances, health, well-being, all parts, each and every part of life, housing, food, nutrition, all parts of it. So to not see that means that you're not acknowledging or seeing the disparities. So I would welcome folks to say, well, what are the different aspects of people's racial identity that you do see if you aren't acknowledging that they are coming from a different racial ethnic background? But then also acknowledging the sentiment that's behind it, which is, I want to treat people equally. Great. Let's talk about equity now. Because it's great to want to treat people equally, but we live in a society where right now that's not possible. Let's talk about equity. I love that question. Yeah, not for others. Great, asking for clarification. Thank you so much for contributing and sharing the requests that stand out to you. Right. Conflict is discomfort. Conflict, anything from discomfort to active disagreement, is change trying to happen. Conflict, we see conflict as like this really bad thing, but I want us to kind of, in terms of this session, begin to think of how tension, persistent tension, could be what is needed for us to begin to move into a different space or a different level of conversation. And that's where this comes in, the importance of transparency. A lot of times people don't want to talk about race and racism because it makes them uncomfortable, because they know that they don't have enough knowledge about it, because they've had personal experiences that make it difficult to, because they're exhausted from trying to have to continue to educate other people, and that's taken an emotional toll on them. There are a lot of reasons why these are difficult conversations. And then there's another root of it. And I think this is also at the root of us being very transparent about race and racism, is that there's a lot of fear when it comes to having these conversations. And so I wonder, do these conversations require a level of vulnerability? And what might more support look like? And I just want you to think on those questions as I bring up this next prompt for us to look at. So for folks who were here before, you might be familiar with this platform, Padlet. But if you're not, I'm going to send a link in the chat right now. And it's going to take you to a site. And this site, there's going to be a question at the top. And the question is, why is talking about racism challenging? And before folks begin to respond, I want you to really lean into those critical questions I just put on the screen about fear and transparency. Why, really, are these conversations when talking about racism so challenging? So there's a circle with a plus sign at the bottom to add a new note, or you can just click anywhere on the screen. I see some folks are already getting started. Your name is not recorded with any of this. It's completely anonymous and you don't need to put your name. So feel welcome to put whatever you like. Wow, a lot of responses coming in. Thank you. Yeah, we encounter fragility or defensiveness, having to acknowledge in public. The transparency that's coming out on this Padlet right here is incredible. Thank you. It brings up guilt. We all come from different backgrounds. Feel like you're preaching or nagging, particularly if you're a person of color. This person's just being a Black woman, right? How people perceive and treat folk for talking about these issues. We need to talk about what we've done wrong. Acknowledging our biases in a public way. Discomfort. You're afraid of saying something ignorant or hurtful, right? But I know that a lot resonates with a lot of folk. Not wanting to risk losing a friend by offending them. Don't want to be seen as bad. Wow. Please continue to write. Continue. There's already 45 on the board. I'm going to come back to it. So if you're just starting to write, please continue, because I want your comments, your thoughts to show up here so I can look at them and continue to bring them into the conversation. But I want us to sit back, and if you need to refresh your screen, to look at this list. And I want us to ask ourselves, are these different aspects of fear around transparency, about addressing or talking about racism, in the broader spectrum of the level of influence that you have in the work that you're doing? Right? Is addressing some of these fears, some of these challenges, not worth it to begin to reduce harm? Is saying something not worth it? Is, having to have that uncomfortable conversation with a friend? Is having to take a moment to say, I'm learning in this space and I don't know, but I don't want to cause harm? Is that moment of vulnerability something that we can consider overcoming in order to be able to reduce the type of harm that we might be causing? Right? Can we clarify that so that there aren't misunderstandings of end goals? Can we acknowledge before we begin that there's so many layers of this and it feels overwhelming, but it's important that we lean into it, right? Y'all are making such great points and things that are absolutely real barriers. But this is a session, as in the sessions, about addressing anti-racist practices. Folks, you began to list some of the biggest barriers to anti-racist practices. It makes a lot of white people feel guilt and shame, and it makes some people feel it takes away that they have achieved based on their race rather than their abilities. Can we talk about that? We don't want to seem bad. And so in avoiding not seeming bad, sometimes in my own experience, I've just not said anything. And how is that perpetuating that silence or that ability in those instances where I had the privilege to not say anything? How did my discomfort scale up against the discomfort of the other folk in the room who had to continually, every day, defend their positionality? We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Thank you so much to the person who couldn't figure out Padlet, but put it in the chat. Yes, I welcome folks to do that too. If Padlet isn't working for you, let me know in the chat, right? Fear of being bullied, fear of being attacked. Those are real reasons. Amazing. All right, I'm gonna go back to our slides. And so throughout this session, you might engage and you might feel comfortable. You might feel like you're learning a lot, but you might also feel really uncomfortable. And maybe you possibly have the desire to avoid the conversation. I would just ask that if you are feeling uncomfortable, you do a quick exercise. You ask yourself why. Is it because this is conflicting with something that I believe before? And if so, can you extend to yourself some moments of breath to be able to stay present and engaged? acknowledging that sometimes we can utilize those feelings of discomfort to escape from an important conversation that could absolutely be beneficial to us as we begin to in this process. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't have the slide up. Right. So we want to recognize that we could be in any of these spaces. But if we definitely begin to feel uncomfortable, we lean in, we assess first our safety, most importantly. But if it's just our discomfort with the conversation, can we begin to challenge that and work on that exercise today of staying present, even when the conversation is challenging? And for folks who would like a more in-depth understanding of this, I did go through it more critically in the other session. So folks in the chat, what happens when we have diversity before inclusion? Right? Diversity is having and bringing in a whole bunch of folk of different lived experiences, absolutely important and critical. We need to have a diversity of lived experiences represented. But what happens when diversity comes before inclusion? The support. People don't have the support that they need. It could potentially be harm. There could be conflict, tokenism, absolutely. Right? They need to conform or change who they are. Yes, absolutely. Little or no opportunity to grow. So you see that inclusion is needed in order for diverse folk to feel welcome. Yeah, I'm here, but every time I walk down the hall, I'm reminded that this isn't a space for me. Yeah, I'm here, but I can't safely use the restroom. Yeah, I'm here, but I have to be thoughtful and intentional about how I dress, wear my hair, I talk, my voice before I enter the space. Yeah, I'm here, but I think critically about how I even position my body to avoid physical harm. Ooh, right? And sometimes we'll get to diversity and we'll get to inclusion, but we don't even begin to process through equity. And so what is diversity and inclusion without equity? Burnout, miscommunications, exactly. What is diversity and inclusion without equity? When we talked about equity last time, we acknowledged that equity is about the actual action that takes place. It's the harder work that is central and at the basis of this. And a lot of times we'll just skip past equity to go into diversity and inclusion. And that's how we get performative diversification. Because unless there's something changing in the culture that not just says, hey, we've created this space, but that there's culture change that's happening and shifting in order to ensure that people who are receiving services here are able to not only feel welcome because we put out a poster, but because every part of how we treat people is being critically analyzed. We're doing the critical self-awareness. We're talking about what's going on systemically and structurally, and we're investigating the accurate histories of reasons why there have been issues around racism and behavioral health. Those things are cognizant and on our mind, and we're taking actionable steps to address that so that when diverse folk come, they can feel included. Diversity and inclusion without equity being first and foremost is like trying to catch up. We have to start to center equity. And so I propose an equity first framing. This is not the work for others, it is for us. So there are several different layers of oppression. And the first layer of oppression is internalized. These are subtle messages, that overt messages that reinforce negative beliefs. And it can be interpersonal. So a lot of times when we're thinking about oppression in forms of racism, in particular within behavioral health spaces, we're talking a lot about these internalized or interpersonal. These are the things that are happening people to people. These are racist acts, microaggressions carried on from one person to another person. This is, the way that people say when they say that they don't feel welcome. This could be because of something that is displayed that a person interacts with, a form that people have to fill out that doesn't feel inclusive or they don't feel represented on. This is the internalized and the interpersonal. This is our work to do to say, I'm checking and assessing my biases to ensure that I'm not perpetuating this type of oppression onto other folk. And then there's structural and institutional, structural and cultural. These are values and systems, things that have been and always will be the way that we do things, or our framing of that. The normalcy of the upholding of racist practices, as well as institutional. These are institutional practices. These are policies and procedures that reinforce racist behaviors within a workforce. But a lot of times we don't even get to that point because we're not willing to talk about the issues. And one of the things that I've noticed and that has been quite prevalent is that deflection, dissociation, and discomfort become some of the main reasons why we don't get to equitable practices, that we don't get to anti-racist practices. Because the conversations are challenging, but they shouldn't and they don't have to be divisive. In fact, I find that most of the time when we're getting to the place where it is becoming deflective or divisive, it's because we're not talking about, we don't have a clear understanding or grounding of what we're discussing and we're not on the same page. So for example, I think that privilege and some of these words on this sheet are words that are terms or phenomenons and theories that get us out of that space of being able to move forward with anti-oppressive practices, because we're not talking about what they mean and we all are navigating from our own internal or applied definition. Privilege is a complicated term. Whenever we talk about privilege, people think that it's specifically talking about either unearned privilege and or white privilege. Those are the two things that I see most synonymously reflected when we talk about privilege. Both of those things are types of privileges, absolutely, and we should be able to talk about them. And also, privilege, you can have identity-based privilege, you can have positionality-based privilege, earned privilege, and unprivileged. And so when we don't talk about earned privilege, it makes unearned privilege really hard to talk about as well. Because some people will assume that when I say that you examine your privilege, I'm suggesting that it's unearned. Well, no. There are a lot of folks who have earned privileges, and privileges are often the things that we don't have to think about. So when we start there and say, all right, well, we're going to talk about earned and unearned privileges, we're going to talk about identity and positionality in the context of a society. And within the US, white identity-based privilege is a thing. It is pervasive. It occurs. And if we can't talk about it in the context of society and how that applies to individuals, even if there are other parts of their lives and experiences where they have other forms of earned privileges or don't have privilege at all, then now we're in this defense mode. But just because you have a particular type of privilege or white privilege, for example, doesn't mean that you don't have areas in your life where you don't have privilege and that are marginalized aspects. And so, again, if you get a chance to look at the other session, we talked about privilege and subjugated identities. And we kind of walked through what that can look like for folks to begin to process. All right, let's not make privilege something that's so hard to talk about because we cannot challenge, we cannot acknowledge. It exists, it's there. Everyone should be able to walk down the street and show love to their partner without fear of harm. Everyone should be able to go into a store or receive services in an equitable way that doesn't make them feel like a threat or a harm, that doesn't put their life or safety at jeopardy. Everyone should be able to demonstrate their faith in a particular space without fear of death, right? We need to talk about privilege because when we don't, then the consequence of it is for other people to resolve. We're going to talk in depth about biases, but I'm just introducing the term here. I've heard a lot of people talk about microaggressions. And for the sake of time, I would normally have someone in the audience and get someone on microphone to read me a definition of microaggression. But you can go ahead and, on your own time and Google it, and you'll see a definition of microaggressions. And that's the definition that we pretty much traditionally use. It's these subtle, unintentional slights, for example, that put down or demean someone, typically someone from a marginalized identity, with specific emphasis on racially and ethnically minoritized folk. Right? They're subtle, they're brief, they're unintended. Those are the key words in the definition that you'll find if you go to Google. Well, I put terms like microaggressions and intersectionality on this slide because there's the part of awareness that is, we need to begin to lean into this conversation to begin to engage in anti-racist practices. The term microaggressions did not always mean that. And in fact, if we go back into the 2007s, we can see definitions that came up in the scholarship, like Sue and Cerzano. Those are two of the scholars who are very frequently cited. That talks about microaggressions, and one of the scholars, Darrell Wingsu, creates a taxonomy of different ways that microaggressions are experienced. That's when the term microaggression began to branch off. But we really think about it and we really lean into the conversation about microaggressions. We go back to the 1960s and the 1970s, where the term was originally introduced, along with a lot of other critical scholarship that came out in the time of the 1960s, 1970s, like intersectionality, right? Like critical race theory. And this scholarship was coming out because there was a critical pivot that was happening within societies and within medical systems and within behavioral health settings and within society, restaurants, social spaces, where it was no longer legal to discriminate against folk. We have the Civil Rights Acts being passed at this time. And there were more subtle and overt ways that microaggressions exist. This is that critical pivot that folks talk about when, issues around racism begin to change. But really what the term microaggressions intended to do was to demonstrate the compounded complexity of the put downs and slights that demean a person. They're not unintentional and they're not unconsequential. That was never part of the definition. And so when we're having these conversations, a lot of times we're having them uninformed because the information is not readily there. But I want us to begin to engage critically and to accept the responsibility of saying, I want to be able to practice racial equity and be anti-racist in my practices. So that requires me to seek truth, to seek knowledge. Right? And then we have this idea in this concept of white dominant culture. White dominant culture and anti-Black racism. These are conversations that typically, again, get people uncomfortable. But the reality of it is that this impacts every aspect of life. What are the different norms, behaviors, and patterns that continue to perpetuate themselves, and what is the system that it falls under? So when we're talking about biases, I want you to keep those terms in mind because I'm going to use them a lot. Anti-racism is not a label. It's not something we can give ourselves. It's a critical awareness and it is specific action. Maybe we don't feel comfortable talking about race and racism because we haven't explored what is race. Right? It's very easy to take a colorblind ideology if we haven't explored how race was developed. What are the pseudoscience and what are the different forms of oppressive scholarship that came out at different points in times that created the social human stratification system that is race. I think that the movement towards colorblind ideology really came from this moment in history when we started talking about the social construction of race, because people said, well, race isn't a real thing, it's socially constructed, so let's not even use it. But in that conversation of saying, okay, well, we're acknowledging that race is socially constructed and that was that is harmful and intentionally oppressive. Let's just not talk about race. Let's just not engage with race. We fail to acknowledge the historical basis of human hierarchy, the lived societal, social, political context, the access to medical resources, the access to housing, the racial trauma, the negative impact that it had on people's life, the ongoing intersocial, internalized, multi-generational impact of race and racism. So it's very much alive, and it has meaning. It has meaning to you and I, and it also has systemic and structural meaning. And so when we disacknowledge race, or when racism continues to perpetuate itself and is ongoing, repetitive, and unresolved, the consequence of that is to create a serious emotional pain and distress that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. But similar to the term microaggression, is so innocuous and is so compounding that people continue to live with these types of stressors. And so we now get to the space where we're just perpetuating this harm onto folk without even realizing it. So we have implicit and explicit biases. Our implicit biases are deep in our consciousness. In fact, if you are working in a space and you actively speak out against issues, it's very possible that you still have implicit biases, because these are things that are deep within our subconscious. They're not necessarily aligned with our spoken beliefs, and they can be influenced. Similarly to our explicit biases, which maybe even are sometimes framed as our preferences, our beliefs, and our attitudes. They are reinforcing each other, implicit, explicit, and institutional types of biases. And so when we get to institutional biases, we're really looking at what are the practices of systems. And I want you to think about the places that you work where there is a norm. And this norm needs not be any conscious or prejudicial discriminatory pattern that is like rooted in malice, but rather the majority of folks simply following the existing rules and norms. Biases are experienced, they're felt like a transfer of energy. They're deeply rooted. And so what I ask you is, what is normal to you? What policies don't impact you that you don't even think about the influence that they might have on an aspect of someone's identity? What are the procedures that you engage with? What is the neutral stance that folks take that you don't think twice about, but that literally compromises someone's ability to show up and be authentic? Right, exactly. It's just the way that it's always been. If nothing changes, then nothing changes. Right, Dean, thank you. And so when we get to take that privileged and positioned idea of, things are working, that's the way that it has been, it's not intervening in this weathering and allostatic load that occurs for communities of color, that occurs when people are experiencing racial oppression. And so this weathering and the allostatic load exactly is this normalization of the everyday occurrences of racialized forms of discrimination. It's not just in one aspect of life. And particularly, I know that this is something that is close to you all in this room's thoughts and minds, because you're always thinking about things in the context of behaviors and health systems, and you're thinking about the different aspects of life and environment and the intersectionality of mental health and all of these different things that come together. Well, if we can appreciate the complexities of health, then let's also begin to think about the complexities of which racism is interjected into these life circumstances, and how people are dealing with and processing that on the additional load, overwhelming their abilities to cope and wearing down their well-being, because they are also dealing with all these things that maybe you don't even have to think about once in your day. A lot of research that came out that shows that people of color make more decisions in the morning than their white counterparts. We're talking about physical energy depletion. Exactly. Which leads us to getting into concepts like race-based traumatic stress and historical trauma. Racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress, I've linked some literature to, maybe I can even provide like a handout. Let me know if that's okay for folks to be able to follow up on some of this or read some of this on your own. But again, racial trauma is this impact on a person's ability to cope. Being physically attacked or exposed to traumatic events. Race-based traumatic stress can be a single event or something vicariously. Think about this last year. Think about the vicarious trauma that we all have experienced around racial tension in the US. Now think about the compounded aspect of that racial tension for the people who are experiencing it personally as if it were their own lives over and over again through this vicarious and interpersonal relationship. Think about the folks who are seeing these tragedies happen within our society, and it's evoking this epigenetic feature through historical trauma, where emotions are transmitted through subsequent generations, right? These are the things that we should be cognizant of. And more specifically, y'all might get a little uncomfortable when I say this, but I want to say it because we need to talk about it. What are the ways that you and I perpetuate oppression? Not other folk in this room, you and I. A lot of times we'll look at an issue, we'll say, that's so unfair, we should stand up, we should stand with those folks. But we don't talk about how that's so unfair. How do I perpetuate it, contribute it, and benefit from it? And that's the pivot that I want for folks to take as you begin to think about anti-racist practices. Oh, for sure, yes. So Samantha talks about vicarious trauma and indigenous communities and the burial sites of boarding schools. Absolutely. Wounds like Tuskegee. Absolutely. And honoring the anniversary of that, right? Tulsa, Oklahoma. Honoring the anniversary of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was one of many, many, many examples of which this occurs. And if you're in this room and you're like, I don't really know what those folks are talking about, this is the moment, right? Juneteenth. You're unsure what Juneteenth is. This is the moment for you. Trail of Tears. Don't know what that is. This is the moment for you. These are things that folks are sending in the chat. Some of them you can see, some of them you cannot, right? Black Wall Street, things that even might have a close personal relationship to people in this room. And so these are some of the ways that we might be perpetuating forms of oppression. We might be perpetuating forms of oppression through exploitation, observing it or not intervening when we see it. So for all of these, it's either observing it, not intervening, or perpetuating it ourselves. All of ways in which we are continuing, contributing, or perpetuating it. So who's charged with doing different things? Do you have a committee for your race equity inclusion team, a small group of folks who are tasked with doing this and it's their responsibility if it is successful or if it's not? If so, that might be reiterating a form of perpetual oppression, providing that there is labor or innovation versus credit. So people are working on this to make the organization or your agency or, this aspect of your agency look good without the acknowledgement of the lived experiences that are part of this process. That might be part of exploitation, right? Then you have violence. And a lot of times people go, well, I'm not, knocking someone out. So there's no way I'm perpetuating violence or an oppression. But I want people to think about violence in terms of forced assimilation. If someone has to change the way that they look, talk, or behave, hold their body posture to be safe or to avoid harassment in your agency, then that is a form of a forced assimilation, which is emotionally violent. Experiencing microaggressive attacks and having to be hypervigilant. Being constantly and chronically mindful of what you say it, how your voice sounds, if your hair, all of these things. Yes, your voice, right? That is emotionally violent for folk. Marginalization, who's reflected in your practice? When you're presenting your data, when you're talking about your commitments to anti-racist practices, are you using language that you know are not going to make some groups of folks uncomfortable? Well, if you're protecting the comfort of someone, then you're also not prioritizing the truth of someone else. And so what are you doing, and how are you having conversations about how, when, and if to respond to racial equity? If your conversation's engaging with how, when, or if, then we're already starting from a different place, because equity is therefore then becoming a conversation about whether or not we should or should not. Ending and addressing systemic racism. Well, maybe we should, that's too much. Well, right? Where is that resistant? Who are we making comfort? If, how, and when. We need to sit back and say, how do we get to have a conversation about if, how, and when to not be racist in our agency? And that helps us think through the prioritization, the urgency of it a little different, you know? Powerlessness, who's being silenced? Is that powerlessness insidious, right? Who do you hire? Mm-hmm. When is silence used for comfort? We're not going to talk about that in this space. This is not the place for it. Well, racism impacts every single aspect of health. So I'm not sure when is not a good time or place to begin to address these things. And then, of course, cultural imperialism, which we've talked about quite a bit. And I'm mindful of my time because we have so much to talk about still, but I'm mindful of my time. Cultural imperialism, this could look at as the values and the norms, implicit and explicit. Yes. So someone puts into the chat, but they only sent it to panelists. They talked about folks being bilingual, voice expressions, laughter, and eye contact, right? Is the value and norm that people should not engage culturally with their voice and their expression in the workplace? Is the perpetuation of unexamined norms that people should wear their hair a particular way when they come to work? Is the perpetuation of unexamined norms that there's a good way to communicate? Is the perpetuation of unexamined norms that it's okay to make offensive and harmful jokes, that we need to just be neutral in how we talk about things and we don't need to name or address specifically issues that come up? So we want to identify the ways that we can contribute to one of these phases of oppression, and then continue to examine our complicity in oppression. And we aren't going to have time to do it today, but I did have another Padlet that I wanted folks to be able to participate in. And I'm just going to read you the prompt because I think you might want to think about it as you leave this session today. And that is, what are some ways that you can pivot from perpetuating one of these forms of oppression? What is a way that you can pivot from one of these forms of oppression? Maybe your role is in hiring. Maybe you have influence over the types of forms that are distributed. Maybe you have influence over policies. Maybe you hear things that are happening. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you, right? Thank you. This is where we land, is to say, I'm not void of being able to contribute this. How do I perpetuate cultural imperialism? I can tell you a lot of ways that I do. Right? That's so unfair. Yes. Someone put into the chat, you know, reading that bar up at the top, right? The pivot in the way that we think about it is, how do I perpetuate, contribute, or benefit from it? Thanks, Samantha. This, I remember mentioned that I send a resources. This is some factors or features of white dominant culture for ourselves to examine, particularly as we think about cultural imperialism. Which one of these tasks do I buy into? Like, is my sense of perfectionism really because, you know, I feel as though this is the exact way that it needs to be? Or is this a factor of dominant culture that I'm buying into that doesn't allow for people to show up or express themselves creatively? And I'm going to close out with these last two slides. More things for us to think about. These are strategies for change. And the other slide is going to be quick things for us to stop to think about. I also see that there's a question and maybe even some more. So hopefully I can get a chance to get to those two. Challenge yourself. Don't wait for someone to show you, teach you, remind you, or encourage you. In this session, you probably already began to identify some gaps. So honor where you're at, honor where that person is, and then intervene. The challenging people doesn't have to be this defensive, divisive, or like even the conflict that we talked about earlier. Honor where folks are at. Ashley, I see that you're in a play, I see that you're serving this community, and I just want to bring this to your attention. I know that you come into the space and you've already shared that you haven't had a lot of experience with this community, but I wanted to raise your awareness about this because it could be causing a lot of harm. And I don't think that you want to cause harm. And not honor where people are at, but intervene. Because that not intervening is, I don't want to be seen as a bad person. Clarify, be clear on the issues and how you're talking about them. Sometimes we'll use really nice data. We're committed to diversity and change. Are you committed to addressing anti-racist practices? Because if so, you should say that, because the people who are afraid that they're going to experience racism really want to know that that's what you're talking about, and not these other issues or ways that we get around talking about it. Our discomfort in addressing the issues is on the head is part of our privilege. And our ability to propose slow and incremental change is an example of our ability to not have a lack of urgency in responding. Commit. Change fatigue is real. Barriers and pushback, conflict, and deflection will happen. Embrace it, name it, and receive it as an indicator to continue to move forward. When people begin to say, well, why are we continuing to talk about race? Everything isn't about race. Begin a thought exercise with folks and say, okay, well, let's talk about how this isn't about race, or how these issues aren't about race, right? But a part of being able to facilitate that conversation is, the first bullet point is challenging yourself so that you don't have to feel like you're fishing or flop. There's no shortage of information about racial inequities. It's just that we're waiting for someone to teach it to us instead of going out and finding this information for ourselves, right? But I honor and acknowledge that y'all are already doing that in this space. So I'm kind of talking to folks who already get that concept. And then culture shift. Avoid actions that treat anti-oppression as an additive, or that reduce the work to an event, a task force, a 4-step initiative. Culture shift is everyday accountability by every person and who is part of it. And so you might want to stop. It's just stop it all. Stop whatever you're doing if there isn't a representation, right? If lived experiences aren't being reflected in whatever you're doing. If you're creating the new form for your agency, and it's asking about the experiences of folk, and they're not experiences that you know of, you need to stop and make sure that it includes representation. Ask yourself, ask others, stand up in different meetings, and how has racism impacted people's experiences? You're trying to get more folk in a community to come. What is their perception? Their perception's rooted in their lived realities. Are you honoring that and asking, how has racism impacted people's experiences? Understanding adverse community experiences. You're getting pushback. You don't understand why. Are you seeking to understand what adverse experiences folks may have had that you might not even realize because it's outside of your daily processing? And be clear, because clarity is rooted in being able to address things explicitly, while comfort is rooted in privilege. And so I'm going to pause there because I know that there's questions. I know there's also a closing slide. So I want to be mindful of that. Gabriel, help me out. So if the us isn't represented, then the us isn't really being served. Yeah. Amazing. Do I have time to answer this question?
I certainly think there's time for the question. I see there's a question in the Q&A, and just for the sake of those folks watching this as a recording, I'm just going to read it. The question says, I am a member of the Q BIPOC community and have other marginalized identities as well. I work in diversity and inclusion, but feel that because of my intersectionality and how I present, I am ineffective with many people. So then on one side, I feel pressured to hide my otherness to be more effective. And on the other, I suffer from battle fatigue, both professionally and personally, having to advocate.
Yeah. Yep. That's such an important question. And I also see another question in the chat. Thank you. I can definitely get to that. Other marginalized identities as well, working diversity inclusion. Yeah. So I think that this question, and I'm going to highlight different parts of it for folks who are still processing it, demonstrates the compound, so on the slide, I didn't really talk about it that much, but we talked about intersectionality, right? And a lot of times folks are using this term of intersectionality to, talk about their hobbies in relationship to their identity. But what you're experiencing or what you're discussing or what this person is sharing with all of us in this room is how critically important it is to not take an essentialist view. And what we do is we typically take an essentialist view and we say, we're dealing with this, this, and this. When we're talking about issues that are anti-racist, and that does not mean that that is the exclusion of other issues. In fact, if we're talking about the issues of folks in the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color spaces more broadly, then that also includes a critical conversation about the other intersectional aspects of people's lives. For example, if we're having a conversation about LGBTQ safety in the workplace, there's also the aspect that Black trans folk have the highest rate of violence experience than most populations in the world, right? The death rate of Black trans folks is beyond alarming. And so there's this idea that talking about, and I know this is deviating a little bit from your question, I'll pivot back, but there's this idea that when we're talking about anti-racist practices, that creates an essentialist view. But what we know when we study the scholarship around intersectionality is that when these different forms of oppressed identities intersect, a common pushback is to say, well, folks don't want to talk about that. And there's a space, but can we also emphasize that when someone is a person of color, when someone's Black, when someone is Indigenous, and also experiencing these other aspects of oppressed identity, the severity and the consequentialness of it is extremely severe, and that in itself must be honored and uplifted and prioritized. And so you working in diversity and inclusion space, but feel like because of your intersectionalities, you're ineffective with some people. So you're feeling pressured to hide the intersectionality of your experiences. But perhaps the pivot that needs to happen, because you should not have to suffer from battle fatigue, advocating for these, is that critical piece of the conversation that says that by taking these essentialist views, and that ties into critical race theory, citing critical race theory, taking anti-essentialist views and intersectionality, means that when we're talking about racial disparities, we must also examine the ways that racism intersects with other forms of marginalized, systemically and structurally marginalized identities. And so that might be a group or different spaces where people are just trying to respond to say that they did something instead of change the culture. So I think that your question really illustrates people's unwillingness to look critically at a culture shift, but to say, I'm going to respond to this. So we said that we did something. I don't know, for the person who wrote it, I'm not going to share your name, but if you want to send a note to the panelists and let me know, does that respond to your questions, or what does that bring up for you? Because I would love to continue that question a bit more. There's another question that, would you like to read them?
Sure, I can read it in the chat. The question is, if we're trying to put equity first, but don't yet have the representation in place, what needs to happen? Great
question. So equity is about the harder conversations. And in fact, I believe that some aspects of initiating of equity need to occur before we start, tokenizing and utilizing people. But so an equity conversation and an equity conversation about lack of representation is a conversation about, well, who needs to move out of the way so that there can be more representation? That's an equity-centered conversation. And I know that that's an equity-centered conversation because that's going to immediately evoke fear and discomfort. Right? If you have the ability to create a new position or change or adapt your position to have more inclusion, then that would be an anti-racist thing to do. That is an action that you can take, because the equity component of it is, there isn't representation. So we can go and we can elicit this support. We can get our staff to be more diverse, and then we'll ask them to take care of these tasks. But if you're in a place of leadership, then that equity-based conversation is what needs to change here so that it can be more representative. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I'm just looking in the Q&A because it looks like another question has or two has arrived. We have a question that says, I am a school-based occupational therapist. I work in an urban charter school serving K to ninth grade with a 98% poverty demographic, lots of adverse childhood scores, ACEs, and need for whole child initiatives. I'm hoping to use, and then I apologize for the acronyms, AOTA DEI guidance to help initiate a community of practice process during our August professional development series and hope that grows and endures. So I think they're hoping for a response to this kind of description of their work.
Well, yes. So for folks who are working on specific, thank you, the person shares that that's the American Occupational Therapy Association, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So, I'm also happy to like chat around like specific things that folks have going on. I believe that my email address and all of that is shared. And so I'm happy to continue conversations. And so one of the things, particularly as it relates to some of the measures, and in this case, we're talking about the ACE, right? We must also acknowledge that some of our best practices or some of the tools and resources that we use, we might need to adjust. And if we're going to be moving into the space of being anti-racist, right? So there's a lot that we can glean and a lot that we can use. The ACE is an incredible resource. And also there's some aspects of racial trauma that just is not covered. So if we're utilizing that as a way to begin to examine the demographic information and the specific nuances of racial inequities that are being experienced by young folk, and this intersection between race and poverty, then that tool might not be all that is needed in order to be able to do that in an anti-oppressive, anti-racist way. And so it's the acknowledgement of that, utilizing the tool with the acknowledgement that it doesn't necessarily get to that particular needed context, and then thinking about how do you? Because it's saying, well, we did our best really would, as you suggested in your other prompt, wouldn't necessarily capture that goal that you have of being anti-racist with that tool. So.
Yes. Thank you for that detailed answer. I think we've got time for one more quick-ish question from the chat before we wrap up. One participant is eager to have you address more that person who says they're colorblind, like a response to that. And I think you had begun saying an approach, but if you could expound and maybe even repeat what you had started saying, I think that would be greatly appreciated.
Yes, absolutely. So in response to that, and there was one other question in the QA about the inclusive of real stories and the uplifting of narratives being a good place to start. Yes, inclusive of narratives and real stories is an important part to start in anti-racist practices, but it's not all of it. So this idea about folks, I get the sentiment even from the person who shares it in the chat that this colorblind person, this is a person or a type of person that is continually experienced, right? And sometimes this person might have a lot of positionality and privilege and occupy a particular role that creates a boundary for a barrier for other people being able to engage in anti-racist practices. The first thing that we need to recognize is if we're engaging in the conversation in a place that's trying to convince or talk someone out or debate someone's humanity or try to get someone to value someone's racial or ethnic identity, we're already in a problematic stance. People's lives is not for us to debate. People's safety, people's well-being, people's trauma, the validity of people's lived experience is not something that we should be able to even have the position to debate. So to the person who's continually exerting that they're colorblind, this is we're in a whole different type of conversation. Because at this point, it's not about seeing people equally. It's about holding a stance or holding this positionality that I'm a good person and I'm not going to see it. And so the conversation needs to pivot. We can talk about anti-racist practices and we can talk about different types of intervention all day long. But if someone's not at the space where they're like, yeah, but I'll just treat everyone equally, then we need to pivot that conversation and lean into it differently and say, let's talk about equality versus equity. Let's talk about the notion or the value system behind a colorblind ideology. And let's see the ways that it is helpful and the ways that it's harmful. And once you get to the place where you see what value that colorblind ideology holds for someone, then you can begin to engage in the critical conversation about how that is a personal, interpersonal, individual experience, and it is completely diminishing a systemic, structural, broader issue. I don't know if you all have access to these folk in that way, or whoever the person is that continues to perpetuate a colorblind ideology, but it's harmful. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's really where we begin to lean in. That's where we begin to create those challenges, but also recognizing that coming with this plan, most of the time it starts with a conversation. And this conversation, if it's that persistent, is why are we holding so tight to this idea that is false?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of response in the chat about the denial aspect of that idea. Yeah, I really could listen to you for so much longer. I would love to hear more of your insight, but unfortunately our time has concluded. And I just want to urge folks to take the evaluation survey. We really appreciate it. The link is in the chat, thanks to my colleague. And don't forget, you can connect with the Northwest MHTTC in various ways: social media, our website, our newsletter. And we sincerely thank our presenter, Dr. Ashley Stewart, for her time and sharing her wisdom with us today. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend. Look for some follow-up emails for us to link to the recording from today, as well as your certificate of attendance. I see a lot of kudos coming in for you, Dr. Stewart. So thank you very, very much again for your informative presentation. We look forward to hopefully seeing all of you folks again at another training. Again, stay in the loop with us, and hope to see you online soon.